Karl Kopinski from Nottingham in England, part of the Super Annie team, and like illustrator and artist of many, many years now. I'm getting old, so I've been doing this for a while, and I've just done a little kind of demo to talk through about my character design process. So I hope you like it. I hope it's interesting, and if you've got any questions, feel free to fire away. I think there's a link at the bottom of the screen that you can send your questions to. So hope you enjoy. So I've obviously with COVID, we haven't done much traveling, and kind of missed a lot of this this process of meeting people and talking a lot, because I think I learn a lot through these shows. So hopefully we'll get back to it soon. So I'm just showing you some of my pens here. So I use a Faber-Castell black pen. So this is a Pentel fine brush pen, and the previous pen was a Pentel Tradio, and then this is the really fine Pentel sign pen, and that's pretty much all I'm using on this demo. It's just fairly simple toolbox I use. Tried to simplify things as I get older, because getting a bit confused more easily now. I'm 50 this year, so got to keep things simple for the old men. So I tend to start the demos with like you can see I'm doing here, like a sort of, I've got an idea in my mind of like the pose or like the movement that I want to get in, but I try to keep the lines that I put down really quite loose and free, because I find I think a lot of people suffer from this a bit as well. Is if you start to tighten up things up too early, you can sort of lose a lot of the energy and movement, especially if you're going in with inks that are obviously quite permanent. So you know, you can be a bit nervous in your approach to it. So at this stage, I try to keep everything really sort of loose and gestural, and but you know, fill it with movement. And also, as you can see on the sort of leg area that I'm working on here, I'm starting to think a little bit about like you know, the perspective, as well as thinking of that figure and how it sits within a sort of 3D space. So, you know, using very simple shapes, you know, like a kind of a tube type shape for limbs, and bearing that kind of thing in mind at this stage can be really useful for once you start to go in with the inks. I think, you know, it's just helps to get that image to sort of sit in its own 3D space, as it were. If you're doing character design, it's all right doing them just kind of standing there looking at the camera or looking cool, but I think if you want to sort of level it up a bit, you really want to try and get some movement and life and energy into it. So that's the process that I'm working with at the moment. I'm going to try and answer some questions as we go along as well. But yeah, it's I mean, for me, like I really admire, like, you know, obviously, like a lot of you know, the work of Kim Jung-gi, and I really admire his ability to put this stuff down straight with the inks. But for me, I'm just I've tried. I just don't think I'm very good at it, and sometimes you just have to put your hands up and say that's not what I can. I just can't do that. So I find this stage is really important and sort of integral to my drawing process, really. And also, one of the things I'm doing here is, you know, I'm sort of designing on the fly. So a lot of these random looking shapes that I'm throwing in are kind of visual cues for me to build up, as you'll see later with this one, a kind of you know, a kind of armor, or you know, whatever your character may be that you're working on. I'm looking for shapes that just kind of break the mold a bit, because sometimes you can get stuck in a sort of loop or cycle of doing the same design over and over and just kind of rejigging it and you know, rehashing it and putting it on a different figure. By kind of throwing some different shapes in there and you know, mixing it up a bit, I find that often I'll get some more interesting design in the actual character. And I mean, for me, that's been really useful. Quite a lot of work come in where I do, you know, character design and you know, sort of costume design, and I've worked on sort of video games, movies, and you know, a lot of different disciplines. I found this technique's quite applicable. So yeah, and I always start with the face. I don't really know why, but I find I really like doing faces. If I leave them to the end of the drawing, I often mess them up. So because I'm comfortable with it and quite enjoy it, I think it's a good way for me to start. And also I can sort of add a bit of mood and drama and expression and that kind of thing. For me as well, it's quite I think it's quite important to get like a sort of bit of believability into the character as well. So I find, you know, got quite a love of portraiture. Initially, when I started out, I wanted to be a portrait artist. So I've got quite a love of portraiture and sort of, you know, enjoy drawing and people, you know, in various situations, whether it's in sketching in the cafe or sometimes sketch from movies I'm watching. And I think it's really a good way to kind of bring your character design to life as well, is to put something in there that makes them relatable to and you know, maybe familiar. And also I'm a bit bored of them always being heroic and sort of handsome, and I like to do sort of more grizzled and battered, and you know, people who look like they've got a bit of a story to tell, or they've lived a bit of a life, rather than, you know, a lantern jaw and a slick back hair, or you know, if I'm doing a female character, huge boobs and a face like a model. It's a bit, I don't know, I just think it can bring a bit more into your character design if you sort of add that element of reality and something that people can relate to a bit more. Sometimes I think that's maybe one of my strengths that I've worked on. So I mean, I might be wrong, and obviously there's a place for those kind of superhero type characters, but I don't think it's my strength. And I think over the years you start to recognize the things you're good at and maybe play them up, especially with like client-based work. It's important to, you know, really build on the things that you do best. And you know, in my spare time, I tend to work on the stuff that I may be a bit weaker on, and I need to improve. So when you're out there looking for kind of clients or jobs, and you've got to really make the most of what you're good at. And I think that takes quite a long time to work that out. It's not a simple process. For me, I spent a lot of time trying to emulate people who I thought were really good or successful, and you learn a lot by doing that, but you don't really maybe stand out from the crowd. So I do think it's important to sort of build on your strengths as well, and you know, put them out there and make sure people see them. So I've just got a little liquid refreshment. So when I'm rendering these areas here, as I said before, I'm always bearing in mind those simple forms, you know, like I mentioned earlier, the kind of tube shapes that make up the arms and forearms, and I'll use them a lot in the armor design to help to sort of put down that perspective that I'm looking for. And so as you see, the pencil lines are quite loose and gestural, but there's still enough information there for me to kind of start to render now, with a sort of perspective and in the final design. I also try to take, like you can see in the video, sort of regular sort of pauses to sort of look back and sit back and look at it, because for a long time, especially when I worked at Games Workshop, I'd kind of get sucked into the canvas and I'd be really close like this, and after a while I'd sit back and realize, yeah, I might have rendered a really nice hand or something, but it was like twice the size of the hand that it should be. So I'd got so lost in working on that one little element that it didn't relate to the rest of the figure. So you know, it's important to have a bit of space and sit back from what you're working on, so that you can always see that it's the relationship of one element to the next. So I take sort of regular pauses to sort of sit back and take it all in a little bit and check that I'm not, you know, making a huge hand and a tiny arm. But I still do it regularly, but maybe I don't post those ones so much on my socials. Maybe I should do a post of all the terrible drawings I've done, and it might be quite interesting. So I've also, I think I've spoke about it before, but quite a love of sort of historical, especially sort of military stuff. So I've got quite a not a encyclopedic knowledge, but it's, you know, I've got quite a large visual library there that I can draw on, and I find that really useful. So you know, spent a lot of time looking at books and you know, visiting museums. There's a couple of great museums here in the UK, and I know there'll be, you know, wherever you guys are, there'll be something like that in your major cities, and they're really useful to sort of see a lot of this stuff in its in the flesh, and you can get a much better idea of how it was designed and it's how it works on a practical level as well, rather than just using sort of photographs and things like that. So I found that to be quite useful over the years, and I sort of draw on that, you know, sort of visual library that I've built up over time quite regularly. And there's a few artists as well who I always come back to, like the work of Mobius is a big influence on my work, just for the line quality. And as I said, obviously a big fan of like guys like Kim Jung-gi, and but also, you know, people with quite different approaches like Ashley Wood, and really love the paintings of Phil Hale. So you know, it's sort of always looking for inspiration and trying to keep my sort of keep myself fired up and interested in what I'm doing. So I think that's quite an important thing to do. It doesn't have to be a direct, like a direct influence on what you're doing at that point. It's about, you know, keeping your juices flowing for making, you know, art, really, I suppose. So I find that quite useful. I think I may, you know, find a new artist almost every week. There's always someone whose work's recommended, or you see from another artist posting on their socials or something. So and yeah, as I kind of, as I'm getting older, I'm trying to simplify things a little bit as well, just because I think for a long time I would get so lost in like rendering things perfectly and making it look really realistic, or and then it kind of by the end I'd be really disappointed because I'd sort of overplayed it, or I'd like overworked an area that was really energetic, or had a really nice line to it, and I've gone back in and messed it up. So I think at some point in this video there's a point where I feel like I might have messed it up, and maybe it looked a bit better before, and I'm always trying to bear that in mind when I'm rendering them. So and it's a really hard, like really fine balance between getting the information across and getting the image down and kind of rendered in the way you want it to be, and then not overcooking things or losing some definition. And I think that's one of the hardest things to really become good at, is that ability to just know when to leave things and when to stop and when to let the viewer fill in some of the blanks maybe. So yeah, maybe 5-6 years ago I'd have been going back in and hatching a lot of this stuff and you know, kind of overstating it really. Now I'm trying to use a minimal amount of lines to put the information down, but maybe think about them a bit more carefully rather than look for them as much as I used to. I'd often be, you know, making marks repeatedly or rubbing things out. So one of the sort of really it's the hard thing you have to do with ink is, I think you walk a really fine line between kind of making a nice sort of job of describing what you're putting down and then taking it too far and messing it up. Whereas when I'm doing an oil painting, I always have that option to go back and forth. So if I mess an area up, I can go back and repaint it. With these ink drawings, it's a lot more instantaneous. You get the stuff down a lot quicker, but you're also walking that fine line of, you can really mess things up sometimes, and they're almost not you almost can't bring it back. It's just gone. So quite a difficult discipline, but I do enjoy that aspect where you're a lot more mindful of each sort of line you put down. It makes you a better artist, I think. So yeah, again, as I said, as I'm rendering these guns here, I'm trying to bear in mind simple forms like a box shape for the top part, and keep that in perspective, so that everything sort of, I don't know, like relates to each other really, as it were. And then I don't know, sometimes I worry that I maybe like, sometimes it feels a little bit like I'm sort of rejigging old stuff, or you know, I might feel like as I'm putting the lines down, sometimes I feel like, oh, I did this last time. It's really disappointing. I just keep doing the same thing over and over. So I think you know, those early lines that I put in, I'm always looking for a different way to sort of render them or approach them as an armor or a weapon type. And it sometimes it works, other times it's a bit of a disaster, really. But you know, those gestures at the beginning are quite really quite useful for sort of designing that stuff, I think. So yeah, I think when I did this this piece, I was a little bit I think I'm a little bit concerned that I'm still a little bit concerned that maybe the face was a bit too big, and I think that's a little bit of my sort of love of portraiture sort of backfiring on me. Maybe I sort of focus that much on the head that sometimes I think I do really big-headed characters. So as I say, it's important to sit back and try and keep checking out how parts relate to other parts. And then when I'm doing this mecha stuff, often it's a lot of these little lines I'm putting in there are just they're almost like reinforcing the form of the armor plate that I'm putting down. So, and even although there's not a lot of shading or hatching going on, even those little kind of dabby little hatched lines, I try to make them sort of follow the contours of the armor or and curve them around a little bit with the perspective as well, just to sort of reinforce that that 3D-ness. I don't think that's the right word for it, but the sort of as I said at the beginning, that feeling of it existing in its own 3D space, as it were. Yeah, face is bugging me a little bit now when I watch it back, but I'm sure my voice would bug me even more if I could hear it back. And here, you know, as I move down the figure, I'm looking for opportunities to add perspective. You know, sometimes I see artists and they'll do their character and put perspective in, but it doesn't really flow down the body, if you know what I mean. It tends to be one perspective all the way down the figure. So especially when it's turning and bending like this, I'm trying to think of how which areas your eye level's at, like you would a building or a geometric shape, or I'm trying to think where your eye level's at, and then even just moving down the leg or the waist, how that would change as you move down. So, and it can really sort of add a bit of sort of interest and believability. And there's so many really good artists out there. It's hard to stand out from, not stand out, but it's hard to sort of produce work that's grabs people's attention sometimes, I think, because there's so much fantastic work. So for me, I moved away from digital quite a long time ago because I was just frustrated with the process. I don't think it was that natural for me, and I was just looking at other artists all the time, trying really hard to work out what they were doing, but not understanding the medium very well. So I went right back to where I began, I suppose, with pencils and pens, and I think I'm a lot more comfortable with that. And also, I think it, you know, still get clients come to me, and I have to say, you know, you do realize I'm ostensibly I'm traditional, so you know, bear that in mind for the projects that you're putting me on. And I've not really ran into any problems with that. And I think it does help me to maybe, stand out a little bit, or maybe grab people's attention a little bit more, because I've got my own sort of approach and maybe line quality, and so I don't know if it's the case, but you'd like to think for people who know the work, it's my work fairly quickly. So I think that's quite an important thing to bear in mind, especially when you doing like character design, things like that. There's a lot of fantastic character designers out there, but if you can put your own stamp on it, your own sort of approach to it, then that's really what a lot of art directors are looking for, is something a little bit different, or something that's got a little bit more like individuality to it, or just a different approach. So for me, that decision to move away from digital and then go back to traditional almost 100% of the time was quite a good move, I think. So anyone who's watching, don't forget to fire any questions across if you've got any. I think I'm a little bit obsessed with jetpacks as well. I don't know where that came from, but I do like a good jetpack every now and then. I think also as a kid, I was really interested in, like, I was super nerdy kid who was really interested in like fighter planes, and just, I used to make those little, in UK we have these airfix kits that you take all the parts and glue them together and make Spitfires, and I think that's maybe stuck with me for my life, really. My grandfather was in the RAF as well, so in World War II, so I think I looked at a lot of this stuff as a fairly young kid, and I don't know, for some reason it's just stuck with me. There's a lot of drawings I do with guys in flying helmets, or girls in flying helmets, and big furry collared sheepskin jackets, and I quite like all that, like where you mix the kind of retro feel up with something that looks really modern. I think it's quite an interesting, maybe an interesting approach. I think also it's quite important to keep some part of your drawing or your design something that's familiar, that people like can relate to, or go, that looks like this, or it sort of grabs the viewer a little bit then, and makes it make a connection with them quite early on. Right, I've got some questions I've got to answer, lots of them. Right, I'm going to start with one from Shayquist. How do you get away from drawing the same or similar character designs over and over? I think I spoke about that quite a lot. It's about looking for new sources and resources to sort of inspire you, and also those gestural lines that I spoke about at the beginning are a really useful way to come up with a new, like design, or just shapes and forms that can maybe make you think, oh, that kind of works as a shoulder plate, or whatever it may be. Okay, we've got someone, Sugata Basak. What are your thought before you draw the first line on paper? Thank you. Mainly, oh dear, here we go again. It's not going to look how I want it to look. I kind of resign myself to the fact that each time I start a drawing in my mind, it's going to be really good. And then by the end, it's either terrible or not as good as I wanted it to be. So Felipe Palmer, when or if you suffer from creative blocks, how do you usually deal with periods lacking inspiration? I've got quite a good mix of clients and projects, so, and also I'll have personal paintings on the go, so I try to have a bit of space in my deadlines, so that I can maybe move around onto something else if I'm really struggling, or if I find that I'm maybe getting a bit of a block on one project, I'll go on to something that's really quite different, or a different medium, or I'll go from oils to watercolors, or a pencil drawing. So I find that useful. And I also ride my bike quite regularly, so getting away from the studio for an hour or two and just sort of clearing my head is quite useful as well, to sort of come back with a bit of a fresh approach to the whole thing, really. A good lead-in segue to this one from Rafael Bueno. How do you see, if you see at all, any influence cycling has on your art? How much exercise, routine and self-development as a person you think can influence how you draw? Yeah, I think it's quite important for me personally, not just from a health standpoint, but I think I quite like the sort of meditative side of exercise, especially something like cycling. If it's quite peaceful roads that you're on, I quite like that time away from the drawing board, but it's still time that I can spend kind of chewing things over and going over problems that I might have ran into at some point in the drawing. So it's quite useful for me to do that. That little bit of time away from the desk, but maybe it's still in a working day over my lunch break or something like that. You can do quite a lot of problem solving during that time. I think it's useful, definitely. So yeah, it does have a big influence on my problem solving more than anything, really, I think. What is your process when drawing clothing and drapery? Do you have any tips for drawing and shading folds from imagination? I don't know if I'm that good at clothing. I don't know, maybe I'm okay at it. Not my best strong point. I try to think of maybe 2 or 3 simple principles, like the folds tend to work in a similar way most of the time, depending on where they're folding, or how they're hanging, or what they're hanging off. So there is like a, you know, if there's one in the forearm, there's a way that the folds form, you know, fairly consistently. There's variations in it, but it's still quite easy to make a believable fold in those areas. And then I also try to bear in mind, quite maybe more important, is the weight of the fabric, or what fabric is that you're trying to render. So you know, if you're doing a heavy sort of thick wool or woolen overcoat, or something on maybe a fantasy character, then you want to think about the depth of the folds and how many there are at that point of articulation. That's quite an important thing to do. Or if it's leather, you know, it might, or something with a bit more really lightweight, like a kind of silk, or then they're all going to act quite differently. The folds are still similar in shape and form, I think, but there'll be, you know, more of a gather in certain areas. So I try to keep it as simple as I can. I think when you're drawing from the imagination, maybe one of the most important things is to keep things as simple as you possibly can, because it's like I said earlier, if it's kind of walking a tightrope. If you start to try and render it too much, or make it look really realistic, then what you do is you cause a huge sort of problem for yourself, because you've got to then do the whole of the rest of the drawing in that manner. Whereas if you can come up with a way to put just enough information in, and you know, enough line quality and form described through, you know, a minimum of work, then you have a unity to the whole character, really, that makes for a far more balanced sort of drawing. So maybe it's that idea that simplifying things when you're drawing from imagination is really the key. I don't know. I'm sort of, maybe it's a bit of an epiphany for me, that maybe I've just come up with something quite clever, which doesn't happen very often, really. But you know, I mean, you see a lot of those really great artists, they don't put a lot of information in there. A lot of it's you know, I really love, I don't know who knows his work, but the work of like Nicholas Uribe, who's like I think he's Colombian artist, and he's so good at putting form down with minimum of fuss. And also Greg Manchester, I think's doing some stuff here on Lightbox. It's all about placing things. It's not, everything's not super rendered and highly finished. It's just placing things in the right place with the right amount of information for it to work well. So yeah, maybe that's quite a useful approach to it. And you know, as you see here on this drawing, all the forms are relatively simply put in. That I'm just trying to make sure that the lines are you know, describing things in the right perspective and right attitude, and also, as I said at the beginning, sort of retaining some of that movement and sort of energy that's in the pencil drawing, the initial sort of gestural pencil drawing, as it were. So yeah, that's quite a useful thing. Quite like also sort of when it comes to drawing the feet, they're trying to like simplify, think of them as the most simple shape you can, really, rather than sort of overcomplicating it and then adding sort of surface detail to that to sort of maybe, you know, add a bit more perspective in there. So, and then now, as you see, I start to go in with a slightly thicker brush pen here. And these Pentel are quite good. The sign pen's really good for a nice fine line, but these Pentel, they seem to have a lot more ink in the tip there, so you can sort of get that weight variation to the line a lot better. So and also the little bit I think a bit more, tiny bit more forgiving. The sign pen's such a fine tip to it that you know, you've got to have quite a steady and controlled hand, whereas these you can sort of scrub away a bit with maybe more than the other one. I think I'm also quite a heavy-handed artist, really, naturally. So I'm probably most comfortable using pencil, where I can press on quite hard, and your weight variation is, you know, of the line is you have to put a lot of weight on to get a thicker line. Or took me a really long time to sort of get my head around using these brush pens, because they were such a different touch to them. They're so, you've got to be so delicate to get the fine lines. And I think maybe I've learned quite a lot doing that, using those brush pens to sort of just slow down. And sometimes with pencil drawings I was a bit like frantic and scrubbing and scrawling away in a sort of manic manner, whereas with the pen, but with the brush pens especially, you have to be much more sort of considered and sort of slow down, you know. And this is where I'm not sure if I messed it up or not. I can't decide whether I like it at the end or not. So I just going in with water here because I'm using an Italian paper that's sort of got quite a shiny surface to it. So the ink doesn't completely absorb into the paper, and it means you can go in with a little bit of water and blend the lines. The sign pen is, the ink's a lot more delicate as well, so if you go in with too much water you can almost completely lose the line that you've put down. So as you see, I sort of start to go round, but then there's some areas where it almost lifts off the pen, like the ink completely, and I have to go back and render it again. But I don't know, it's quite a nice technique that I've used. I've used it quite a lot, especially if I'm doing events where you don't need a huge sort of you know, watercolor set or a big setup. You can just have water and a sable brush like this, or I've even used those really cheap kind of water brush pens where you just fill them with water and you can go in and blend like that. So it's quite an interesting technique. Sometimes successful, sometimes less successful. But it's also one of the keys is the paper that you're using. And I think this is an Italian paper called Magnani, Magnani technique mixed, which is sort of mixed techniques. So I'm going to go back and check a couple of questions. So I've got one from Nicholas Quezada. How did you learn anatomy and how have you incorporated it into your work? Really, I didn't sort of, I sort of just was interested in anatomy from an early age and had a lot of sort of books with, there's a couple of books by Hungarian artists that had anatomy, human anatomy, and then some different animal anatomies. And also like I was really into biology as a you know, as a student at school. So I had like Gray's Anatomy, which is a medical journal, because I quite like working out what was going on underneath the skin. And I found that was, as I went on and got older and started doing live drawing classes and things like that, it was really useful because I didn't, it's not like a sort of a, you know, a sort of super accurate knowledge, but it's like a working knowledge of the muscles and the skeletal structure and things like that. And I've found that to be really useful even at life drawing classes, because you might be drawing the model but you're not maybe aware of what's going on there physically, whereas if you've got that working knowledge, you know why the light's particularly bright on one point where maybe the collarbone is, or the tip of the shoulder and the bones nearest its surface, and also having a sort of a knowledge of how muscles work in sort of you know, counteract each other's, like your triceps and biceps, and one pulls and one pushes, and I think that sort of thing is really useful. I think the important thing is to be maybe is to understand that you don't have to go like too, I mean, you can if you want, but to do what I'm doing, you don't have to go super deep into this stuff, but you just need to just take enough information in to make it sort of, it's got to be practical information. It's no good knowing, it's okay knowing the names of all these muscle groups and, you know, the bones and it, but really you need it to be practical information that is there to be used in your drawings. And that's how I approached it. I wanted to know how things work, how the human body works as a machine, and that's been really useful for you know, my, especially for my ability to maybe to draw the figure from imagination. It's sort of integral to what I do, and I still, you know, still enjoy doing a lot of the characters, like especially fantasy characters where you can go in and have areas, you know, like the arms exposed and just, you know, have armor or clothing on the chest, and to be able to put in a bit of that sort of knowledge of the human body is quite useful. And then once you have that, then you can start to look at animals and see how they have similar muscle groups and how they work in a similar way and apply that to those animals. I would not say I was as good at, you know, drawing animals as I am at drawing the human form, but I can kind of get by because I know enough about you know, how the muscle groups work, and how if you can apply that to like a horse or a dog or something like that, it's a, you know, it can be really useful as far as sort of drawing them from your imagination goes. So yeah, it's really important, I think. And also always recommend people to try and spend time drawing from life, whether it's life drawing classes or, you know, drawing friends and family, or, you know, drawing from maybe, you know, even pausing a movie and making quick sketches. That's really useful. Each time you do it, I think a little bit of something sort of sinks in, and you sort of add it to your library, as it were. So here now I've gone in with this pen's called a Pentel Tradio, and it's like a sort of almost rigid nib, slightly pointed. There's a tiny bit of flex in it, but it's just really good for doing those sharp, crisp lines. And I use it a lot on maybe on papers that are a bit more porous and absorbent. It's quite a nice forgiving pen to use, and you can kind of scribble and scratch a bit more with it. So quite like this pen. I think maybe the first time I got it was given me by Miss Jisoo, who's part of the Super Annie team, amazing artist, Korean artist. So I think she maybe gave me my first one of these, and I sort of took to it fairly quickly and really like it as a pen. So yeah, I'll go back and check some questions. How do you, this is Tyler KP, how do you create dynamic poses from imagination? Whenever I try, I end up with limbs flailing all around. I think maybe if sometimes, say if I'm doing like a bigger painting, especially, I'll make like small, or even you can do it for these kind of things, to make small thumbnail sketches with, you know, really tiny, like, you know, maybe 1 inch high, couple of centimeters high, and try to really get a like a movement or a sort of gesture down really, really quickly, and then sort of try and you know, as you put the gesture sort of thumbnail down, you're bearing in mind that it's a figure, with that's in motion. And then once I've done that, I want to try and sort of almost like stick the limbs on into place using those simple shapes that I spoke about before. So, you know, if you've maybe in your gesture you've done one arm, you know, out front and one back, then I try to put those down, bearing in mind them as the most simple form, as a sort of, you know, for me it's always like tubes or spheres or cones, or, you know. And so by doing, like, your gesture might have a really cool movement, or you know, like look really dynamic, but then you've got to try and get the limbs to sit on it correctly. And for me, that's by using these sort of simple shapes and then keeping them in perspective, because that's so important with the gestural drawing. Might look really cool, but if it doesn't look like the arms pointing forwards or backwards, then it just falls apart and you lose all of the believability. So yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but that's the answer anyway. So Cuomo Moose, what's your view on artists taking mental health breaks? Well, I think everybody's a lot more aware of the sort of mental health thing these days. I mean, I've had quite a sort of tough year myself. I'm sure a lot of you know, I had a hit by a car back almost a year ago now, and it sort of really did hit me hard mentally, you know, excuse the pun, but it was you know, it makes you realize that you've got to give yourself sort of space. You give yourself some headspace to try and you can't be creative in if you're in a, you know, if you're in a bad place mentally. So it's so important. It's like you know, sometimes you can get lost in the act of producing work, and sometimes that works as a sort of, because you're maybe learning a lot, or you're speeding up, or you find that you're getting a lot of productivity, or you because you're doing a run on something, maybe you're developing things stylistically, but you can't maintain that. You've got to take time to step back and give yourself some sort of headspace to assess what you're doing and what's important, you know. So I think that's, you know, super important. Peter O'Hara says, how do you study other artists' work to see how they approach a similar subject matter? To be honest, I think I've basically spent my first maybe 10 years as an artist just copying people whose work I love, you know, and having like a crisis about how good they were and how terrible I was. And yeah, I mean, I study other artists a lot, and I think really I've learned an awful lot of what I do now from trying to emulate the people whose work I really admire. And I still, you know, find myself taking time to, if I've seen something that an artist's done that I really sort of loved, or really was, you know, inspired by their approach to something, or even how they handle a medium, or something like that, then I happily try and make time to sort of copy it, really, not not literally copy the image, but to take some of what they've done and incorporate it into my own image, or some of my own work. I think it's sort of really like the idea of always trying to be moving. I mean, you're hopefully forwards and developing as an artist, and you know, by looking at other people's work and recognizing what they do well. I mean, really, the reason that you admire other artists is because then maybe they do something really well that you're not so good at. and then you don't recognize what you do well particularly, but other artists maybe admire that in your work. So in a way, it's a great way to develop, because you're drawn to the stuff that maybe, you know, they're doing a fantastic job of and you don't have in your work. So by doing that, you're sort of working on weaker areas or areas that you've maybe neglected. So I think it's really important to look at other artists and don't be afraid to sort of, you know, lift a bit of what they're doing and put it into your own. I'm not saying, you know, go out there and copy somebody's work, but, you know, welcome a bit of what other people do in a great way into your own stuff is a good way to develop. I think it's really important to also sort of try and take a bit of time to you know, one of the reasons I started doing all these sketches was I wanted to take some time to sort of play with things, really, not always be beholden to clients and deadlines. And I think that's sort of super important to people, especially when they're starting out and they, you know, they really want to get better and improve, and sometimes, you know, they can become so lost in sort of client work and getting out there and getting people to see what you do and doing the right things or what they think's the right things, that you don't take time to sort of play or enjoy uh, having a go at something, or trying something a bit different. I think that's really important for your sort of development over the years as an artist. You've got to be able to sort of take, you know, half an hour a day to just mess around with things and make mistakes and do a bad job of something. But, you know, you have to learn a lot more from the stuff you do wrong or have a go at that's maybe not how you'd normally approach stuff. So I think that's really important, definitely. Just gonna have a swig. So I've got a question here from Magnus Marshall. Do you have any advice on balancing, specializing, putting yourself into a box, practicing, improving versus making money now to pay the bills, etc.? I think I was quite lucky because you know, I did work in a design studio at Games Workshop for 7 years. So for me, I was in a position where I was getting paid a wage, and obviously I was producing stuff for them, and but also we were learning a lot because I was in an environment with a lot of other artists like you know, Adrian Smith and a guy called Paul Dainton and Alex Boyd, really fantastically talented artists who you sort of a little bit intimidated by, but also trying to sort of, as I said earlier, incorporate or emulate a bit of what they were doing. So in that sense, that was a great sort of a lucky position to be in, because it's almost like there's a little bit less pressure on you because you're taking a wage, you're not freelance. So it's not, if you're not working, you're not making money. So you, like, if I look back now, I wasn't as productive then as I am now, but it did give me a little bit of time to sort of try and absorb what was going on around me and sort of develop as an artist. I think, like I said earlier, about taking a bit of time, even 30 minutes or half an hour to you know, have a go at something that maybe you wouldn't normally have a go at. Or I'll often have like a personal project on the go, like the cycling portraits that I do. They started as a personal project, and that's been really good because it gives you a sort of bit of a mental relief from what you're working on to pay the bills. also you can be really free and loose, and you don't have to sort of, you're not beholden to anyone as to when it's finished, or when it's, you know, when the deadline is, and what medium you use it. So it's your thing, and that's a really important thing to be able to do. I think the only way you can do that really as a freelancer is to be quite organized about time as well. So it took me a long time to work it out, but I now know that, you know, I need to have maybe 2 or 3 clients that I'm working for, and then I can vary the projects that I'm working on through the week, and some of them I can do in a much more relaxed manner. So I'd be working maybe in front of the TV in an evening to sort of design things or come up with sketches for a project, and then in the day I might be doing something a bit more sort of involving painting or something like that. So organization's quite important, but you've also got to really do think it's important to have time to sort of play around and try stuff out. I don't even know if I answered that question properly. I think I'm getting old, so I've started waffling a lot like an old granddad, you know, when they're sat in a rocking chair on a porch, sort of talking about things that weren't what people asked them. So I'll try and be a bit more succinct. Any advice on how to learn composition? I don't know really. I think it really depends on the image, you know, and you know, there's a lot of clients I work for are quite varied as to even like practical stuff like the scale that it's reproduced at. So for example, if I'm doing like you know, I do a lot of work for Magic the Gathering, it's reproduced at for the most part a tiny scale, you know, so you've got to bear that in mind at its earliest stage. So you're at your thumbnail stage, you've got to think, how's this going to be printed, how's it going to be seen? So with a magic card, you've got to have a design that's maybe strong enough or silhouetted enough that a strong silhouette that will read at quite a small scale. Whereas if you're doing something that's a book cover or a box cover or something like that, then you can be a bit freer in the elements that you put in. So when I start out a composition, it's the first sort of consideration is, what's this being used for? What scale will it be reproduced at? And of course, there's always the ones that come back to sort of bite you, where you do something that's reproduced this big, and then you turn up at an event and they've reproduced it 8 feet tall for the poster. That's usually a horrifying moment, and everyone can see the mistakes you made, and they're all like a foot wide. So but yeah, and then I think like if you're doing multiple figure compositions, it's really useful to break it down into sort of relatively simple planes. So you know, your background, your middle ground, your foreground, and try and work with those. And I'll often use light to draw the eye, lighting to draw the eye to one area, or to make, you know, an area in the foreground not too overbearing. You might put it in shadow. So there's a lot of sort of techniques. And also when you look at a lot of those sort of paintings of the old masters where they do those kind of battle scenes, they're using similar sort of techniques. Obviously it'd be on an epic scale, but you can take those and apply them to what you're doing. So that's, you know, to round it up, I'd say, you know, good, consider what it's for, and then a good strong thumbnail. And when I'm talking about a thumbnail, I mean something, you know, quite small. And by doing that, you can't get too lost in the figures or the characters that are in there. You're just putting them in as elements and trying to consider how You know, you lead the eye through the painting or the drawing or the image that you're doing. Often we'll try to make, you know, lines that flow through the picture or lead your eye to the next element. It's quite an interesting part of the actual design process. Squeen, mentally speaking, is there a large difference between doing sketches and a production piece? Does one easily transition into the other, e.g. a sketch that keeps growing? Does the latter require significantly more planning? Yeah, I mean, maybe sketching, like the sketching like you see there is, you know, I've got to a point now where if I'm working, like I've done work with clients like Ubisoft and people like that, where you're designing maybe a character for a video game, really, you know, I could take that drawing there and color it up digitally, or, you know, using Procreate or Photoshop, and that's, you know, really you're working within the same sort of boundaries. Really, it's not too big a leap to do that. But some of the other production pieces, or like the Magic the Gathering cards or things like that, I like to try and keep a bit of the sketch work in there because, as I said, I like that sort of lively, sort of flowing, energetic lines and things like that. So maybe, like if I'm doing a bigger painting, there'll be an underdrawing that's not dissimilar to that. But then obviously you've got to be almost resign yourself to the fact that most of that's going to go by the end. It's part of the process. It's part of making the image. You've got to be prepared to sort of, you know, lose or almost destroy some of the work you've done before by, you know, covering it with paint. So it's quite different, but I'm always trying to incorporate a little bit of the stuff that I like in maybe one element of my work into the other. So, you know, whether it's the sort of underdrawing or the way I've applied the lines, or I'll try and incorporate that into sort of bigger paintings. Hi, Carl. I can't draw 01. As a beginner to drawing, what would you advise from day one the person should be doing? Just drawing really all the time, probably. I think doesn't the sort of the hardest bit, but the great bit about drawing is there's no real shortcut to it. There's sort of more efficient ways to improve, but there's no one way that makes you great really quickly. You've got to be prepared to put in just loads of work and sort of be really sort of a bit tragic, really disappointed and annoyed with yourself and stressed out and all those things. But sort of maybe the most important thing is to realize that that's not a bad thing to be frustrated or disappointed, or because that's the whole point. You're trying to get better, aren't you? So if you just did it and you were like, wow, that's awesome, it'd be like, oh, what do I do now? So the most important thing is that you've got to look for little improvements in what you do, and also work really hard at the areas that you're weakest at. And to be efficient, you've got to sort of train your eye to look at things much more. I think a lot of people look at things, but they don't really understand what they're looking at, or they don't take time to sort of absorb it, you know. So if you can teach yourself to look at things with quite a sort of fresh, sort of almost like a childish sort of eye, you know, and be interested in things, then they stay in your mind, and sort of it just keeps that interest in the world as a visual sort of place. So having that sort of attitude is quite important. And then maybe from a practical point of view, it's like, you know, learning some fundamentals, learning like, you know, how to draw and render a sphere or a box in perspective, and they're really useful exercises, and drawing from life, and doing sort of you know, studies from, as I said earlier, like paused movies. You can learn a lot like that. But yeah, just don't beat yourself up too much when it's not really how you want it to be, because I've never done a painting that was how I wanted it to be, or a drawing. It's always something that I hate or don't like, or could have been better, or why did I mess that up? It's part of the process. So Callum Gillespie, what's your go-to palette for oil painting? So as I said earlier, I'm getting old, so I'm simplifying everything so that I don't get confused so much. So I tend to do as limited a palette as I possibly can, really. And I'll set it out in quite a sort of similar way each time. It'd be titanium white. And then from the white, I go earth colours that way, bright colours that way. And it'll just be one yellow, one red, and one blue normally. So I think I'd use like a cad red, maybe depending on the painting, I'll vary them. Sometimes I'll go like a Naples yellow, or a cadmium yellow, cadmium red, ultramarine blue, something like that. And then I'd go yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and then like a blue black. Normally I use blue black quite a lot. Or Payne's grey, or even take ivory black or something and mix a bit of blue in with it. But I vary them painting to painting, you know, depending on the image and how I'm sort of, you know, it might be lit by a yellow light, so I've got to put some more sort of yellows in there. And also some occasionally I'll use more of a glazing technique over the top of stuff. So when I use that, I might use like a, I don't know, an Indian yellow, or like an alizarin crimson or something like that. But it's still always a pretty simple palette. It's like, you know, maybe 3-4 bright colors, 3-4 earth colors, and titanium white. Super nerdy, that question. Thank you. Do you have a favorite snack to have around while painting or drawing? Coffee is the only snack, really. It's just coffee. No, don't snack much, really. Good breakfast and then coffee. Got a question from Zulu. Hi, Carl. Do you have any tips for drawing and designing hair? That's quite a good one, because I think some people get lost in, when they come to render hair, they start to sort of draw individual sort of hairs in, and I really, it's fine, but you know, like if you're drawing a beard or a hairstyle, it's got a form of its own. It's not just hairs flopping around. It's got a shape to it. So I think it's really important when you come to do that, you've got to, your initial thing is to look at the form of it. So if it's a, even if you draw a moustache, you know, that thing will sort of stick out and make a much deeper shadow below it. So really it's like a wedge coming out from the top lip. So if you think of these you know, the hairstyles, or facial hair as having a form of their own, that's a really important consideration initially. And then really you don't need to go in and draw each hair, but try and get your lines to sort of flow with the shape and the form of the hair, and then by doing that, really you're describing it by the line, really. So and also, you know, obviously there's a lot of different sort of hair. So, you know, if you're doing like I don't know, an afro sort of hair, it's got a lot more sort of shape and form to it, so you can handle it. The lines that you use to sort of shade or shape it can be quite different to something that's you know, more sort of long or flowing. So a lot of the work you can do with the way you describe the form, rather than sort of obsessing about doing a nice sort of flowing line that really just sort of dangles off the head. It's got to be there describing the form of the of the of the um, of the hair. Like if you're a sculptor, you wouldn't just get to the hair and roll out your clay into long things and then stick it on. But what they do actually is make the shape and then put the lines in over the top. And I think that's or you know, the marks in to sort of describe it. And that's quite a good approach, you know, especially when you're doing people's faces and portraits and or the figure or anything, I think maybe. But it's to think sculpturally, if you're doing a face, you wouldn't like roll a ball into an egg shape for the face and then sort of carve the eyes in. You spend all your time shaping the form really, and that's the same principle with pencil and oils and things like that. So think of the form and then use your lines to sort of describe that form and also the type of hair. I think that was all right, yeah. Daniel Naval, what is your process when drawing fantasy creatures where real life references aren't exactly accessible? Dragons, goblins, sci-fi or machinery. I think maybe I'd just take my cues from sort of existing creatures really, and sort of mangle it all together a bit, you know, like I don't know, if you're drawing a dragon, there's no reason you can't look at maybe the physique of a cat or a hyena or something, and look at those look at how that anatomy works and those proportions, and apply it to a dragon, and then you can kind of mangle everything together with some, you know, reference from obviously lizards or crocodiles, or I mean, there's just so many weird creatures out there. Really, you'd be hard to really, it's hard to create anything weirder that exists already. So for me, I just often look for forms, shapes, and things that exist in nature and kind of push them and, you know, play with them a little bit to get something new and interesting. Well, not always new, but interesting anyway. And you know, it's the same for elements like you know, the wings on dragons, and looking at, you know, the way like a fruit bat's membrane on its wing, how the light goes through it, and things like that, where you're not just about the design of the creature, but you can make it look believable when you come to render it as well. And then same really with sci-fi and machinery. I sort of look at a lot of, like, you know, the sort of old, you know, like a, you know, I remember spending a lot of time looking at sort of Russian cosmonaut programs, or the way your jet engines are built, and when you take the covers off them, and all that kind of stuff can be really sort of inspiring to sort of apply to a mecha design or something like that. So there's a lot of stuff out there. It's almost about taking it and putting it, taking taking it out of its context in real world and applying it to what you're doing, you know, or designing it. And also, it's like I said earlier, it's that thing of, if it looks, part of the trick of making it look believable is it's almost got to look recognizable, but in a different sort of context, maybe. Sort of just people go, oh, that looks like, you know, a jet engine, but it's not. It's really cool. It's on his shoulder pad, and I think that's quite a good sort of way to approach that sort of design. Jake House, hi from Lincoln. Oh, hi, Jake. I recently purchased your third sketchbook and was blown away about how real the faces on your characters felt. How do you determine where features sit and the overall anatomy of the face from such varied angles? Do you imagine a Loomis style head or anything similar? I think I read somewhere, I don't know who said it, maybe it was Sargent or someone, I don't know, that might be wrong, but I remember it was about capturing the likeness of a person. And one of the most important things to do was to consider the spacing and size of the features, because you can recognize a person from maybe, 50 feet away, but you can't see the color of their eyes. It's about how all those features sit on the face. So and also you look at someone like Sargent, I mean, he's walking the line between caricature a lot of the time when he did those amazing sort of society portraits. Often, like, he's pushing it to the limit. He sees an element in the face that might be, really distinctive, and then he sort of pushes it. Also, there's like, really, when you spend time looking at people in real life, there's such a huge variety. Again, you might draw something and think, oh, that doesn't look right. If you look around, you'll find that people's faces especially are hugely varied, and wouldn't be how you'd maybe design a correct face. So I think once I recognize that those elements, that it's good to sort of push and play with things, and and really try to sort of vary it a lot. And I mean, as far as using a Loomis type principle, maybe, but as I said just a couple of minutes ago, that I always bearing in mind the sort of, if you were to make the face from clay or in 3D, you'd spend so much time modeling the contours of, you don't just draw the eyes on, you've got to kind of model the brow, and you've got to sort of get all these contours in for and that's where your work goes in. Really, you spend all your time modeling those, and looking at those sort of subtle transitions from sort of light to dark, and how abrupt a nose might be, and as opposed to the transition on a cheek, and things like that are really important to consider. And then you almost, your features, the sort of eye lids are almost the last, nostrils and the line of the mouth almost the last thing to go in. So it's all about, maybe like the demo, maybe I put a few loose lines down, but after that I want to spend like 85% of my time sort of modeling the contours, and that's sort of a good approach to it, I think. Bass 26, I want to grow on social media. My two passions are life drawing and weightlifting. I want to grow both. I struggle with what to create and draw for my social media posts. I only tend to post artwork that I'm happy with. Art, how do I approach art and social media? I don't think I don't know if I'm that good at it. I think I got quite lucky, really, to get the following that I got. I sort of got on there at the right time, and maybe I don't know. I mean, posting regularly is quite important, I suppose, and I don't think you should just post stuff that you're happy with, because a lot of the time people aren't looking at it for that long anyway. And also, often people will see something interesting in the stuff that you're not happy with, or maybe you think you didn't sort of succeed in what you were putting out there. But also, I think it's important to put stuff that's means something to you as well, or is quite personal. People are interested, and in you know what you're interested in. If you can do stuff that's incorporates your sort of passions or things that you enjoy, then obviously the work will be more sort of have a bit more depth to it. I think that's quite important. Luca Cassandra Carver. I was wondering if you could talk about the influence of historical genre paintings on your work. Well, I mean, for me, it's sort of like that when I, especially maybe at Games Workshop and that, I would, it was sort of what I was aspiring to, or I mean, to me, it's like anything. If you like, if you want to be a musician or get good at the guitar or play basketball, you aspire to be the best, don't you? You look at the people who are amazing at it, and that's what you want to do. So, you know, you want to play. For me, as a kid, when I used to love basketball, so I wanted to be like Michael Jordan. You know, to be a guitarist, I wanted to be like Jimi Hendrix. It was you sort of always aim high. You're never really going to get there, but you know, there's no point in aiming for mediocrity, is there really? So for me, like those historical genre paintings are like you don't really get much better than a lot of those guys. You know, I like love the paintings of Ilya Repin, and you know, simple fact, they probably worked on them for years. I might only have 3 weeks to do the painting that I'm working on, but I still want to try and take a bit of what they're doing. So it's sort of super important for me to look at those guys. And also the interesting thing for me, especially at Games Workshop, was that I was suddenly occurred to me, well, not just at Games Workshop, but it occurred to me that a lot of them were sort of they're storytellers. They're sort of recounting stories. It wasn't photography, and things weren't documented by film. So those historical genre paintings, they were also documenting events or sometimes propaganda or so. In a sense, when you're doing a fantasy painting or a sci-fi painting, you're trying to document something that there is no, you know, sort of footage of or photography that sort of to just you know to show these things because they're ideas, but you know you still still the same principle that you're sort of trying to tell a story in a painting. So I think that's a really important thing. You know, for me, like I love the Napoleonic paintings. There's a guy called Meissonier and Detail who really they were sort of patriotic sort of paintings of French soldiers battering everyone. But you know, from a sort of artistic point of view, they relate quite closely to what I was doing or I still do. So in that sense, there's someone who's really good at doing their thing, you know, and they've maybe spent years honing that skill. That and refining it and using reference and it's to me it's interesting to see not just the end result but the process they use to get to there. So they're really important. And then you know again, like if I'm doing I mean you can see two portraits behind me on the wall there of my kids. So it's you know it's looking at people like Sargent and you know Lucian Freud and sort of you know I want to look at the people who are really good and inspire me and like want to take a bit of that and get it some of it into what I'm doing. As I say, it's a bit frustrating and disappointing because you're looking at someone who's just barely sort of untouchable or you're never going to really reach that level. But it's also really rewarding when maybe you do something where you think I think I got a little bit of that in there, and it's sort of it's quite a sort of it's quite nice to feel like you. It sounds a bit sort of silly and romantic, but I quite like the idea that you sort of walk in the same path as these people you really admire. It's sort of something that I really love about cycling as well. It's like you know I can if I was into football, soccer, I can't really go and play on the world's greatest stadium, Wembley or wherever. I can't go and kick my football around. But with cycling, I can ride the same roads as the people you admire or professionals ride. And I like that idea of, like with painting, that you can walk the same path and you can really relate to what they're doing, and sort of, try and take a bit of it and get it into your work. So yeah, it's very important. Marcus Rogers, hi Carl, do you have any tips or design sensibilities for placing figures within a scene? Your magic cards are inspirational, but I have difficulties combining figure work with environments. Okay. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I'm a bit lazy and I don't put them in an environment, or I use the mists of war to cover whole vast areas of a canvas that I can't be bothered to draw or paint. So, but I think it's sort of, maybe the important thing is for it to be something that's in the design process quite early on. You might, it's all right, like this guy here I'm drawing in the demo, he's just sort of dangling in space. There's nothing around him to relate to. There's no environment. But if you were designing something, especially for like a Magic the Gathering card or something like a book cover, then it's important in the beginning to consider the environment that they're in. And it can also be quite an interesting way to then approach the composition. So you may want to place a certain figure higher than another. So you start to put a staircase in, or a different piece of a building, or put them up on a hillside so they're looking down. So if you can maybe get that kind of thing in early doors and place you, then you can look at placing, like for me, say I was doing something like that, then I'd get the thumbnail down of where the figure might sit in an environment. Then I'd probably take an hour or two just thumbnailing the figure, knowing where it's going to sit, and then trying to get like a something that's an interesting pose or design, or you know playing around with different options for that. And then of course using sort of digital media, you can really drop things in and out, and put play around with that. I don't really do that. I tend to just do it all on paper. But that's probably one approach, is to sort of consider it from an early point. Akira one, do you have any book recommendations for creature design? I don't. I really like the work of Tara Whitlatch, who did a lot of work on the Star Wars movies, and she seems to really know her sort of creature anatomy and be able to play with it. I know Claire Wendling. I really like the work of Claire Wendling. She's great at sort of drawing animals and creatures. But I think for me, it's like I mean, the internet's a great resource, obviously, for like wildlife photography. And as I said earlier, the sort of nature's design is probably enough to inspire anyone. You just have to dig around and look deeply. And I was really, as a kid, sort of super interested in like David Attenborough sort of nature programs, and always found that really, really interesting. So, you know, for me, sort of first port of call would be nature and sort of the real world. I couldn't recommend one single book that I'd use, but also a bit of, like I said earlier, a sort of anatomical knowledge of sort of creatures and animals is really useful to sort of play with the design a little bit more, you know. And even when you come to doing like goblins and orcs and things like that, you have to look at the sort of ape monkey kingdom, and there's so much weird stuff there that it's not a great leap of the imagination to sort of play around with those things and maybe push some elements in one direction that actually you come up with something that looks quite freakily weird but believable, you know. John, sorry, it's not John. Oh, yeah. Yes, John, send me a couple more questions. Sandermans, hi Carl, greetings from Amsterdam. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. I was wondering how you schedule your workday week. Do you follow a certain routine? Yeah, I'm like I try to keep a bit of flexibility in there. As I said earlier, I like to have a couple of sort of different projects on the go. I've got and also I'm lucky now because I can pick and choose my clients a little more. So um, you know, I like to work with clients that haven't got a super sort of stressful deadline really. Um, and lately, say I've got one digital project on the go, character design stuff, and then I've got one large painting on the go. Then I'll have a couple of like these kind of sketch type things, and maybe a cycling portrait that I'm working on. I sort of flip between them, but obviously when the deadline starts to loom, then I'll put a bit more time into and prioritize the things that I need to get done. But like try to build some flexibility in my week. I think also because when I worked at Games Workshop, as great as it was, after sort of 3 or 4 years, I started to think, I'm getting a bit bored now of doing the same things, the same characters and the same images and the same, the designs really. So I like to sort of mix things up quite a lot really. And then I also take time to do a bit of exercise and, get out on the bike or something that gets me away from the studio, but I can still kind of think things over and sort of do some problem solving away from the board. Is drawing board or easel is really useful. Get a sort of quite a new, fresh sort of viewpoint on it if you're away, but thinking about it. So, Mikhail Kolacek, what is your usual go-to format? On college, I always almost draw one-to-one on paper as large as door, but when I try anything smaller, I get more trouble. Oh, I don't really stick to a format really. I've got sort of, I do maybe just adapt the medium that I'm using for the format. So, if I'm doing like, I might carry a small sketchbook around with me when I'm out, then I'd use a much finer pen. Or if I'm painting now, I work quite large so that I can be quite sort of use quite broad or gestural brush strokes to get things down. And you know, I don't like working too small for client projects. Really, I like to, if I'm doing something, I like to work maybe 1.5 times bigger than it might be reproduced. So it just tightens it up and crispens it up when it's printed, and hides any monstrous mistakes you've made. That's quite good if you work big, when they shrink it down, you can't see any of the cock-ups really. So that's quite a good pro tip. Arya Pandy, hey there, Carl. You've probably been asked this a gazillion times, but I'll take my chances. How do you deal with an art block? Any tips on the same? Yeah, as I said earlier, the art block, and it relates to what I just said about my working sort of schedule. It's for me, it's about having a bit of variety in content and medium is really useful. If I can have just something that I can go and you know, play around with that's quite different to the thing that I've got blocked or stuck on. It can really, it's useful as well because you know, you might do a painting in watercolor that's a totally different approach to doing something in oils or an ink drawing or a digital, but each time you do that, then you take a little bit of something that you sort of gives it its uniqueness or its freshness, and you can sort of put it into the thing that you've got sort of bogged down on. And I think sometimes that's why you've got bogged down, because it's not feeling fresh or you know, unique or not unique, sort of lost its energy and things like that. And of course, sometimes you just have to throw it in the bin and just say it's a bad job. I messed that one up. But and also get away from the desk if it's really bad. Don't just sit there. You've got to recognize when it's hits you. Just get away. Just take an hour and leave it. You know, it's not gonna. If it feels really bad at that moment, it's not going to get better. You're not going to just push through it. You genuinely need to come away from it. And I mean, that's the idea of doing something quite different. Really, you're moving away from that thing you blocked on, even if it's just for 1 or 2 hours. And it's worth doing, really, even if you're on a super like tight deadline. If you think you're just walking in mud and making a mess of stuff, you're better off to just go and take an hour or two, you know, blow the cobwebs out or ride my bike or whatever, go for a walk and try and come back to it with a bit of a fresher eye. But yeah, screen. How much do you think about lighting in a scene design versus just its execution as shading? Lighting is maybe more of a, obviously not so much in these line drawings, but like if I'm doing a magic card, I'll often do a color rough, or even sometimes if I'm feeling, you know, like particularly youthful, I'll use digital and, you know, play around with things like that. But I think, again, it's a design element that you can't really skip. You've got to sort of, it's like thumbnailing stuff. You know, you can't really sort of do it on the fly, for me anyway. And if I'm doing a painting, the color rough is just as important as the compositional sketch, as the thumbnails for the figures, as any studies I might do for faces. Put you know, a decent amount of time into doing a color rough, and whether it takes 2 or 3 to get it right, obviously that's the joy of digital. You can sort of keep you know, playing around with your options, but you know, don't skip that, because inevitably you run into a block later. It's really important to, especially in bigger paintings, to recognize that you sort of good preparation. It's like the foundations of a good painting. So it's like building a house. You don't just slap the bricks on and then wonder why it's all a bit wonky and doesn't look very good. You got to sort of sort those foundations out, and they are sort of your design, your thumbnails, your composition, your lighting, your color roughs. So yeah, it's important. Oh, this is a good. The comic artist Neil Adams, who brought a new level of realism to comic books in the late 1960s, once said, paraphrasing, "Style is everything I'm doing wrong. At what point do you personally step back from photorealism? Is there a mental dividing line at which point you say to yourself, enough is enough, I'm not a camera?" That's very good. I like that. Yeah, well, I think that's really important, and it's something. It sort of like comes with confidence over the years as well. I don't think when you start out, you're so obsessed with being better and, you know, looking at the people whose work you admire and being realistic and rendering stuff perfectly. But in the end, you can end up just producing stuff that's really sort of dry and boring and so it's really part of your maybe development as an artist is to start to recognize the things that you do well and the things that make you maybe more a little bit unique or interesting. Not always about rendering stuff to a photorealistic level. They're about your line quality or the way you choose to handle brush strokes or your approach to lighting or things like that. And I think it's I mean, for me, like, you know, when I look at like Jungi's work, what I really love about it now is it's sort of, you look at his earlier sketchbooks and there's a lot of studies and sort of a lot of lines and a lot of sort of description of the form with hatching. And then as he's evolved over the years, it's like, sort of, I've said it before, it's like Jedi level where you just do like 1 or 2 lines to describe the form, and then the viewer fills the rest in, and then you really engage in the viewer because they're doing part of the work. It's not in a lazy way, they're part of the artwork, so you know they're totally engaged with it at that point. And I think that's really important sort of thing to sort of recognize, and you know, it's sort of, it's a bit like developing a style. It's something you can't really push because then it looks sort of contrived or like you're trying to copy someone else. It's like something that comes with sort of doing it for years and becoming a bit more confident in what you're doing and not feeling like you always have to prove that you're amazing at what you do, and because that's not the point of it really, is it? Is that sort of a bit, it's just massaging your own ego. There's always someone better than you. There's always somebody doing something better than you. So it's about, you know, it's about sort of your ability to sort of tell your story in your way is really important. And I think people are drawn to that. Even with character design, I think the reason that I get a lot of the work I get is because I've got a way of doing things, and they want me to do my version of what they do. And I mean, when I started out, nobody came to me for that. It's come over the years, you know, so it's super important. So yeah. Okay, so I've just got the nod to say let's end on that question. So thanks to everyone for sort of tuning in and listening to me waffle on for nearly 2 hours. Sorry if anyone's fell asleep, or if you want to see me work, obviously it's all over Instagram, Karl Kopinski. I've got a YouTube channel again, Karl Kopinski, that I'm trying to put more stuff on, sort of demos and very much like the video you've seen here. Also got 4 or 5 books, sketchbooks that you can buy through my store, which are on my website, karlkopinski.com, and limited prints and blah blah blah, all that stuff. But the important thing is, I hope you've enjoyed, you know, what I've had to say, and maybe inspired by it, and you know, make you want to get out and keep drawing and keep working. And I think the important thing is to sort of enjoy it and have fun with it as well. Not always be looking at the end goal, but enjoy the process of learning and improving. So yeah, on that note, I shall sign out and say thanks for joining me, and thanks to Proko and the lovely Stan, who I didn't see today, but I'm looking forward to catching up again for a beer. So all right, guys, take care, look after yourselves.